And welcome to a very special EWTN Bookmark. We're joined by the one and only Raymond Arroyo, host of The World Over, and of course, also a well-known author of Mother Angelica books, and also Will Wilder, The Amulet of Power, Book 3 of the Will Wilder series published by Random House. Great to see you, Ray.
Thank you, Doug. Great to be with you, at long last.
Exactly. So we had a chance to finally talk about the third in the series, which is actually out in paperback right now, right?
It is. It is. Look, any excuse to get out of quarantine, Doug, I'll take. But I finally got a paperback edition of the book because of your interview. So they sent me one. And it's nice because kids, I've learned, when I visit schools, they like to have the paperbacks because they can throw it in the backpacks, they can throw it in the car. It's somehow less cumbersome than the hardbacks. I prefer the hardbacks, but kids love these things. So far, it's all in paperback and accessible and inexpensive for families and kids to read.
Now, do you find that there's a different audience you reach then because of the nature of the paperback, like you just described, that you'll see kind of a blip in the sales because you are reaching that different audience?
There are some people, particularly schools and kids, there are some families who will not buy a book until it's in paperback. And I've encountered that as well. They say, when's the paperback coming out? And I'm like, I don't know, buy the hardback. But they wait. So I think it's because of the portability. Kids can kind of, they mark it up. They can mess it up a little bit more. The hardback is more intimidating for young readers, I think. But then I have other members of the audience who love the hardbacks, my older audience. And, we do have a large span. I have everybody from 8 to 80 reading this book, and probably a few older.
Was that your intention?
It was. It was. When I read my kids Treasure Island and Peter Pan, The Jungle Book, the books I loved as a kid, Sherlock Holmes, when I went back to them as an adult, it's like reading a whole different story because you suddenly see through adult eyes and the life lessons you picked up along the way, all these subplots and a background that you never expected before. Right. So when I wrote the Will Wilder series, I purposely wrote it for the child reading today and the child at heart reading a few years later. So I wanted that experience, and audiences have responded that way. In fact, my adult audiences are as rabid fans of the series as the kids are.
So you get that transition over, you found that as well.
I have, and it's been good. I like that. I like that multi-generations are reading it because often they read it together, Doug. You'll have a grandmother or a great aunt or a great uncle and mom and dad reading it with the kids, and they share the experience and how they're encountering the material, and they're sharing their life experience, which is really what I wanted to accomplish with the series.
Now, the first book came out, about 4 years ago? 4 or 5 years ago at this time?
First... about 4 years ago. I think
okay, now back then
maybe? 5 years ago.
Yeah, back then you could say that the Will Wilder series, my first foray into fiction, started as a soap opera. How so?
It started as a soap opera because I started writing it when my children were very young, and my only duty around the house was giving them their baths and getting them ready for bed. So to get them to move through the process of bathing, get out of the shower, towel off, put the pajamas on, get into bed, I would create these little stories, and it was about a impetuous 12-year-old boy, the general outlines of the family as they became the Wilders later. This child would get into misadventures, and there was a supernatural edge, but they were slapstick tales with big, huge climaxes and cliffhangers at the end or in the middle of every tale. And I did that so the kids would move through the bathing process. So it did start as a soap opera. And if you keep the cliffhangers coming, the kids will keep reading. They'll hang on for that tale. And my kids made it to bed. So
why did you pick 12 years old? I mean, you had 3 children. They were all multiple ages at the time. Why 12?
Well, my protagonist, Will Wilder, is 12 years old because I think that's a transition point when a child is seeing the first glimmers of adulthood. They're beginning to understand in a deeper way what's on the other side of adolescence. And at the same time, they're still children in some ways. So I like that. It's a big transition point when you're 12. You're beginning to see your place in the world, and you're kind of, you're still with mom and dad, but you see what's ahead. And I liked exploring that moment in a person's life. And for Will Wilder, it's perfect because he has the impetuousness and the curiosity of the young, But he's burdened with the understanding of an older person because of the gift he has. He has a supernatural gift to see things we don't, mainly demons, and later we learn angels.
Right. Now, what does Will Wilder owe to a certain St. Lawrence O'Toole?
Ah, Lawrence O'Toole. Funny you should bring that up. When I was in Ireland doing a PBS special, we were shooting at the Christ Church Cathedral. And the Christ Church Cathedral is the Catholic cathedral in Dublin. And the patron saint of Dublin is a St. Lawrence O'Toole. Now, I had never heard of him. I didn't know him from Peter O'Toole, or O'Toole's, the brew. But on the wall, high up on the wall, at the Christ Church Cathedral, there was a wooden reliquary containing the 700-year-old heart of St. Lawrence O'Toole. Well, when I was there, someone came in the night. They threw a ladder up against the wall. They clipped the chain holding the relic above the cathedral, and they stole it. And my son asked me, Daddy, why would anybody want to steal some old relic? It was that question and the missing relic that really was the seed and the germ that created the Will Wilder series, because in every book, Will encounters a relic of rare power, a relic that is usually to be found in antiquity and history, and in many cases you can find the items, the relics, the antiquities I mentioned in the book, you can find them in museums, libraries, churches all over the world. And fans of the book love taking Instagram pictures of themselves in front of these items and sending them to me, which I love, because it's a way of introducing kids to history and this continuum that you and I are all a part of. And I think today, so much young fiction focuses on me, my little mission, who I am, my truth. This series is all about Will Wilder's particular gifts, but how he fits into a family saga and a family's trajectory. Because I think we're all connected to that. We don't do any of this alone. No one's in isolation. So I loved that part, and I wanted to tell that story. That the family goes on the adventure together, and that's what happens.
Right, and you use a relic in each one of the stories, right? One St. Thomas's finger,
I do.
right?
One from the Old Testament and one from the New.
And then Moses' staff. And I noticed in the back of in the author's note, you actually said you have received countless letters and emails from readers asking whether the relics mentioned in the books are real, and then you kind of lay them out. Yeah,
and they are. Many of them are. And I in the back of the third book, I mentioned where you can find them, because people thought initially I was making this up. Well, I make a lot of the stories up; they're fiction, but a lot of the history surrounding the relics. Indeed, the opening chapter of every book is a flashback to Will Wilder's great-grandfather Jacob, usually during the World War II era, and we find out how the family came to possess this particular relic. Those scenes are usually rooted in a historical moment, and everything around Jacob Wilder is true.
Right. Now, you said that more than an entertaining series, which you say you hope it is for people, Will Wilder's part of a larger mission for you. It is an effort to encourage literacy in the young. Was that just something purely you wanted for your kids and for other kids, or what got you focused on that?
Well, I stumbled into it, Doug. I mean, I first wanted to tell these stories because I thought there was no story like this, a series where the entire family went on the adventure together. It's unique in that way, and even my editors at Random House have mentioned that to me. The other thing that I discovered when I wrote the first book was the literacy crisis we have in the United States, and the vast percentage of people who cannot read. The functional illiterate rate is like 66%. The number of kids at fourth grade who are at reading level continues to decline or remain static, and it's pathetic. So I thought, what can we do to inspire kids to read, make them want to read? And the best thing you can do is give them a story that intrigues them, give them a story with a lot of cliffhangers. And I learned that from my boys playing video games, Doug. They were playing video games, but these video games are not the ones you and I grew up playing. These are really episodics. They're almost like soap operas with huge cliffhangers, and you only get to the resolution of that chapter when you go through the play, when you solve and master that particular level of play, that's the dynamism and the drive that makes a lot of these kids stay playing video games for hours and hours. I thought, why can't we import that into a book? And so I tried to do that.
Yeah, that kind of role-playing approach that's so popular. You also say
the drama of that, the dynamism of a story well told.
Right. Right. You said, I created Will to transport kids to places they might never have a chance to go. In an amazing turn, it has taken me to many places I would have never gone. How has it affected you?
Well, part of it is I've got to go to hundreds and hundreds of public, private, parochial schools around the nation. I profoundly understand, in a way I didn't before, the connection between literacy and attention to a child. The great generations that we lose when we don't give them the gift of a story. And when I say story, I don't just mean a book and a fictional story. I mean their own story. Their mother, their father, their grandfather, their grandmother. That family story is important to every child. And feeling that they're connected to something that went before and something that extends on, and that they're the linchpin, they're the link that brings all of these people and their experience forward. And the lack of that, Doug, the lack of attention, the lack of love, the lack of caring to introduce a child to literacy and reading and the world of stories, I think it hurts you when you go into some of these settings and see that. So to be able to bring that and excite a child about the story and to give them the books, sometimes I go in and people will donate the books to the school, that has been incredible for me. And that's what I mean by taking me to places I never expected to go.
Let me ask you as well, because you talk about the family, and the great-grandfather is the founder of the town of Perilous Falls. And I always think about your grandfather, Mr. Tony. And I was just wondering, how much of an impact did he have on you in writing this book and thinking in terms of the generations in your family?
I was blessed not only to have my grandparents in my life, my great-grandmother lived in the house with us. So though it's not, none of these characters are based on my family. I mean, you know, my grandfather was a Italian chef here in New Orleans, had his own restaurant in New Orleans, a restaurateur. But I understood the relationship between older people who love you and can be tough with you because they're trying to shape you for life and had their own tough experiences, and a young person trying to find their way and their gifts. So it's the understanding of that I brought in, and I didn't realize it till I was finished the first book. Aunt Lucille, she bears a lot of the marks of the relationship between my great-grandmother, Nettie, and myself. But she didn't look anything like her. She didn't do any of those things. She didn't have any of Aunt Lucille's a very refined woman. You know, my great-grandmother was you know, very direct, earthy woman of the, you know, the neighborhood who worked at the Sands Hotel in Vegas. So it's a very different background. But yeah, that experience of who you've come from and the legacy that you carry forward and the burden of that I understood. And Will Wilder has that in his life.
Now let's talk about the Amulet of Power, book 3. Now, Samson's hair. Are you interested in hair, or do you just decide on Samson's hair?
Well, look, I could use a little of Samson's hair, I mean, as you can see. But I've always been fascinated with that, you know, and here you have an amulet. The Amulet of Power is an amulet with the locks of Samson, the judge, the strong man from the Old Testament. And I just loved the idea. Now, this is a relic that didn't exist in history, but he existed in history. The locks existed in history. The relic never did. Many of the other relics I have in the book, Joan of Arc's helmet, many of the other little you'll see sarcophagi and other things in the book. That's all real. The amulet I kind of fashioned, but I loved the idea of a young person coming into contact with an item that would give them instant power and strength, superpowers, and the burden of that. What does it mean to be strong? What is strength? And that's really what Will understands and learns in the course of this book. And look, Doug, I've always loved supernatural thrillers. It's the kind of book I was drawn to as a young person. It's the kind of book I like now because you can relate. In some ways, it dramatizes in a big way the small movements of the spirit and the heart that we all live through in life. And I think you learn a lot because it's so big, it's so supersized. And the Amulet of Power allowed me to kind of blow up the story and take it in interesting ways here.
Right. Well, did it make Will a good football player?
It makes him a good football player for a little while, but not a great person. And that's part of the lesson he learns.
Is that the trade-off for him?
Having that strength. What now?
Is that the trade-off, in a sense, that power impacting on him being a better person?
So. Well, it leads to, he's using the relic for himself. He learns in the book, he snatches the relic and uses it for himself. That's not what we're ever called to do with a gift. It's not about you. And when you think it's about you, chances are you're missing the gift. And that's what he learns. And he realizes that strength resides not only in him and his little relic, but in his friends, in his family, and in even the weakest member, the physically weakest member of his group of friends. It is there where the greatest power resides, the real strength resides.
Right. So do you see that in some ways with him, almost like the ring, the idea, the temptation, because he now has something that he can use?
Yeah, we're all drawn to that ring. We're all drawn to that thing. You know, you want the power, you want the control, you want the strength, and it's what every story I think grapples with. When you finally attain that, is it all it's cracked up to be, or does it destroy you in granting you these powers? That's what Will wrestles with in the book. I think that's what all those Lord of the Ring books are about. I think it's what all great fictional literature, what all fantasy is about. That allure of evil at times masquerading as good, and the trade-off.
Well, let me ask you a question outside of that, but talking about power, working in the media all these years, working, in politics to some degree in the early days, but that whole idea of Washington, obviously the World Over program, I mean, you must see a lot of that power and an impact on people's lives for the good or the bad of it, right?
All the time. They're all tempted to the Amulet of Power. I'll never forget our dear friend, Father Richard Newhouse. The first time I met him was at a luncheon in D.C. And when I walked in late, per usual, Doug, he was in the middle of his speech. And when I hit the door, I walked in on him, and he was standing in front of me. That for some reason, they put the podium in the middle of the room. I walked in, and what I heard from Father Richard at that point was, "Oh, I feel so bad for you people here in Washington. You know, I'm from New York, where there's worlds within worlds around every corner, but not here. This is a one-game town. Power, my power. And if you're not very careful, that power can overwhelm you and crush you utterly." That was my introduction to Richard Newhouse. Never were truer words spoken. They imagine that is the center of the universe, and it is not. Right. And I've seen so many lives crushed in that clawing to power and titles and esteem in the front of the room. That's not where any truth or goodness lies. But it is where a lot of pride and hubris lie. And Washington is strewn with those people.
So Will Wilder,
carcasses of them.
Right. Well, they might end up in their own perilous falls, or maybe they're already there. In book
we're all in perilous falls, particularly today.
Number 3 ends with a cliffhanger. So I guess there's a number 4, right?
It does. I am working on book 4. I will say I get letters all the time, particularly from my female readers, my girl readers, who are very concerned about a certain cast member, someone very close to Will. Yes, I purposely left a big cliffhanger at the end, and I am working to resolve it for you now.
That's right.
That person more time than I wish.
That person in the boat transmogrified right into someone else.
Something's going to happen. Something's going to happen. I promise you. But there's a big turn in the story. We're learning a lot of secrets about the Wilder family here. A missing grandmother reappears. There's lots going on in this book about fathers and mothers and the relationship to children. How we protect our children, Doug. We try to protect them from from their own gifts at times because we're afraid of them or we're afraid for them. And how that's, though it's a good impulse, it's a bad end.
Right.
And all the characters are struggling here because there's a big crisis. There's a big crisis. The town is under assault.
Now, when you put this together, I remember in the early days, the way you went about it wasn't like you sat down and wrote. You laid out each character. There's a map for the town.
Yep.
You've laid this all out. Has
Yep.
your plan of the characters changed and evolved as you wrote the books?
Yes, 100%. You know, here's the look. Random House did a beautiful map, which is in all the books, which is much more advanced than my stick drawings. But yes, things change. The characters shift. I laid out all of the books I wanted to write just so I could have my own arc for each character and know where this story was going. That doesn't mean that the path there hasn't shifted. I'm still going to the same end, but boy, have things changed along the way. Yeah, the characters start to take on their own life. They interact differently. New characters are introduced and things change. And you got to go with it. You have to let the dynamism of the tale tell itself. It's one of the lovely things about writing a series. You learn that you are the servant of that story. It is not your servant. And that's a key thing I learned in the process of this. These characters and their story is moving down a train. I have to notate it and ride with them. But you can't, if you force it, you ruin the story. Right. And I just wrote 2 picture books that are coming out probably next year. And those are very different from the Will Wilder series. They too have their own form, their own shape, and you've got to get out of the way and let the story tell itself. It's like this, it's like news, it's like anything. Right. You serve the story, the story doesn't serve you.
Well, speaking of characters, there was a great character we both had the privilege of knowing, Mother Angelica, in the book, The Remarkable Story of a Nun, Her Nerve, and a Network of Miracles, which is in multiple languages around the world right now. And you wrote that book, and I was wondering, moving from a biography that you worked on for many years and other books related to Mother that were more, documenting material. So how did you move and how did you find the move from that kind of nonfiction to fiction? Now, today news, some people, certainly our president would describe a lot of the news as fiction, but in theory it's nonfiction. So how was that as a transition for you? How do you do that?
Well, to me, it's all the same in that you're telling a story, and you have to be true to that story. So the story of Rita Rizzo, the story of Mother Angelica, there were facts, there were parameters there. I knew what I was dealing with. In some ways, that's a much easier story to tell, Doug, because then you just serve that, but the facts you don't have to make up, the settings. So I went out. You had to collect the pieces. You had to go to Canton, Ohio, and you had to talk to the friends and interview her sisters and the brothers and spend time at the house. All those little bits and pieces. You're trying to bring enough morsels to the table so that when you serve it to an audience, it feels like a meal. But they're filling in half of the gaps. You just want to give them enough of a framework, enough color, that they're drawn into that world, and particularly into the character whose life you're revealing, which in this case was Mother's. So I loved, it was a labor of love telling that story. There was so much new that hadn't been revealed that she entrusted to me that I felt I had to share with everybody. I mean, it's a remarkable story. There too, Doug, I shaped the telling of it, but you had to get out of the way. And allow inspiration, allow the Holy Spirit to creep in between the crevices and the lines there, to move and lay that story out the way it's supposed to be told. So it's not a big shift for me. In many ways, for Will Wilder, I do a lot of research. I go to museums. Monte Cassino is the monastery of Saint Benedict.
Right.
That figures prominently in the 3rd book. The Louvre Museum opens the book in book 3. I went to both of those places. I know these. I've gone to these caverns. I've gone to the rooms I describe. So I had a functioning framework and a picture in my head of where we are. Whether it's fiction or nonfiction, it operates the same way. You're telling the story, and you're telling it truthfully. And you asked me earlier, you laid out these stories. Do you dictate where it goes? Not really, because the truth of the tale will tell you where it's supposed to go. The truth will find its way out. You have to get out of the way.
So how
And
long does it
that's
take
what I
you
try to
once
do when I'm writing or telling you?
Yeah, you've laid out the storyline for the next, and you've got to sit down and do it with everything else you're working on. How do you find the time, and how long does it take you?
It's harder and harder now, Doug, because of the other obligations. It usually takes me 6 months to a year to do one of the Will Wilder books because they, unlike Mother Angelica, unlike nonfiction I can write anywhere. I can be on a plane, I can be in between appointments, I can do it in the afternoon or morning. Anytime I have a scrap of time, I can work on a nonfiction product or project. Fiction is different. You have to immerse yourself, and I write at 3 or 4 hour stretches because you need time to enter into, in this case, perilous falls.
Right.
You've got to get back into that world and into the heads and hearts of those characters. And the reentry is never fast. It's always, unless you're doing it every day. But so I find I need a lot of time to write fiction, whereas nonfiction I don't need much. I gather the facts and can build it fairly quickly. So it takes more out of you. Fiction takes more out of you, I think.
Well, make sure you take care of yourself. We'll be looking for the next edition of Will Wilder. The one and only Raymond Arroyo.
You bet.
Great to have you. Thanks for finding the
Thank you,
time for
Doug.
us. Of course, Mother's biographer. And of course, this book, Will Wilder, The Amulet of Power, Book 3, now in paperback. Softcover, available through our EWTN religious catalog. EWTNRC.com for all of Raymond's books available. Thank you for joining us, Raymond, and thank you for all joining us here on this special edition of Bookmark. Thanks.